In the year 1881, the winter came early to the northern mountains of Montana Territory. By the end of October, the first snow fell not in soft flurries but in sheets. Bitter winds blew out of the Canadian north, driving sleet through timber and bone alike. In the mining towns and homesteads scattered across the territory, folks lit fires too early, burned too much wood too fast, and prayed that whatever game remained in the hills would stay long enough to be hunted. But the game had vanished by November. By December, the soil froze deep. Wells went silent, and the hunger settled in like a second winter, unspoken, heavy, dangerous. That's when the stories began. Sheriff Malcolm Burke. That's how he was known. That was the name engraved on the dull tin star he wore, the one pinned crookedly to his sheepskin coat. His reputation stretched as wide as the prairie winds. Some called him dependable. Others whispered of cold stares and colder silences. One thing was certain. Nobody could recall the last time he'd smiled. He'd been sheriff of Bleak Hollow for over 12 years, a narrow town with a wide main road. Bleak Hollow sat cradled in a frozen basin beneath the Bitterroot Mountains. Population never crested more than 120, and that number included travelers who stayed a night too long and horses with names. Sheriff Burke's horse was one of them. A massive roan mare named Josie. Most swore she was half Mustang, half something else. No one had seen an animal that large move so quietly. She don't whinny, don't stamp, don't fuss, said old Jasper Mullen, the stable hand. It's like she listens more than she breathes. By January, food was no longer rationed. It was gone. The general store, once stocked with dried beans, flour, coffee and salt pork, had shelves that echoed when wind passed through the cracks in the walls. Even the rats had fled. Josie, however, had grown bigger. One Sunday, Pastor Eames held mass in the frost-covered church. Only 7 attended. Among them was Burke. He sat in the back, gloved hands crossed, eyes unfocused. When the service ended, he didn't rise with the rest. He stayed in that pew for another hour until the light dimmed through the broken stained glass. The next day, the bell at the watchtower rang. Sheriff Burke called a town meeting. Only 13 people came. His message was brief. The territory wagon won't come this winter. The pass is blocked. Everyone is responsible for their own survival. And that was that. People went home. Some cried, some packed. A few just sat in the snow. But one woman, Nora Hensley, approached the sheriff with shaking hands and a question on her breath. "Sheriff, what are you feeding Josie?" He didn't answer, just looked past her, eyes narrowing toward the northern ridgeline. Then he tipped his hat and walked away. The next morning, Nora Hensley was gone. Neighbors claimed they'd heard nothing. No horse, no wagon, no scream. Her door was ajar. Her stove was still warm. Sheriff Burke led the search, but he didn't follow tracks. He walked directly into the woods behind her house, straight to a clearing no one remembered being there. He returned 2 hours later, empty-handed. "Nothing but snow," he said. Josie, however, had a new leather strap on her bridle. Folks swore it looked like Nora's old luggage belt. No one spoke of it again. By mid-February, the weather took on a new cruelty. Snow fell in long, endless lines that blurred windows. Children forgot the sun's shape. Livestock collapsed in fields too weak to rise. The town butcher, Edgar Griggs, resorted to boiling bones just to flavour water. And then 3 more disappeared. A trapper, a schoolteacher, and the boy who swept the saloon floors. Josie remained strong, her coat thick, her eyes glassy. She no longer nuzzled passers-by. She simply watched. At night, the stable filled with strange smells. Some said it was rot. Others claimed it was iron. No one confronted the sheriff. Then came the tracks. Snow around the sheriff's barn revealed odd patterns. Hoofprints, yes, but not all matched Josie. Some were smaller. Some looked dragged. One morning, the butcher left a message on the door of his shop, written in soot. "I know what he feeds her." By dusk, the note was gone. So was the butcher. People began locking their doors not just to keep out the cold, but to keep in whatever truth had begun to breathe behind their walls. Sheriff Burke no longer patrolled. He simply walked, from his office to the barn, from the barn to the tree line, Josie followed, always in step, never lagging. The townsfolk stopped speaking her name, as if the horse might hear it. When March crept in and the thaw began, someone carved a phrase into the frozen windows of the saloon. Hunger walks on hooves. That spring, the sun returned. The snow melted. New families passed through. Children played in the street. The general store restocked. But Josie remained, her eyes darker now, and Sheriff Burke never spoke of the winter again. Some say he buried the truth in the thawing woods. Others believe he fed it to his horse. The final snow of March had begun to melt in the gullies around, Bleak Hollow, but it left behind no promise of spring, only thick, sour mud, and the memory of what had not been buried deep enough. And as the ice loosened its grip on the land, something else began to unravel. It started with a man named Clifton Reeve. Clifton was a recluse, a trapper who lived north of town in a leaning shack, built from railway sleepers and nailed shut from the inside each night. He spoke to few, bought only kerosene and bullets, and fed a trio of dogs he never named. On the first Saturday of March, his dogs came running into town alone. Their coats were stained dark, not with blood, but with something thicker, something sticky that clung to their undersides like syrup. They whimpered outside the general store for hours, refusing food, scratching at the floorboards. Sheriff Burke stood watching them until dusk. Then, wordless, he mounted Josie and rode toward Reeve's cabin. He returned the next morning alone. "Coyotes must have gotten to him," he muttered. But townsfolk talked. Reeve was a crack shot. His cabin was fortified. No one had ever heard of a coyote gnawing open a trapper's door. More unsettling, the dogs never left town again. A week later, all three were found behind the church, their bodies stiff and heads missing. Then came the schoolteacher. Her name was Esther Monroe, 26, from Ohio. Her arrival in Bleak Hollow had been the closest thing to a celebration the town had seen in years. A parade of 6 children, holding hand-painted signs that said, "Welcome, Miss Monroe," had met her wagon in the fall. She taught reading by lamplight and arithmetic by candle. On March 14th, she dismissed class early, saying she felt unwell. She was never seen again. A search party found her house empty, her hearth cold. No signs of struggle, no boot tracks in the mud outside, but something odd. Every one of her school books was stacked perfectly on the table. On top sat a small wooden figurine, a horse carved with such precision that it almost seemed alive. Its left eye was painted black. The right one was missing entirely, gouged out. Sheriff Burke confiscated it. The school remained closed for 2 weeks. Not long after, 9-year-old Thomas Clee vanished. He had been helping his father repair a shed near the edge of town. Just past noon, Thomas went to fetch a hammer. He never returned. Neighbors swore they saw him walking toward the tool shed. One even claimed to see him stop to pet Josie, who stood near the well. But when they searched, the boy's tracks ended near the water trough. There was no sign of struggle, no trail leading away, as if the snow had swallowed him whole. His mother wept so hard, the doctor sedated her for 3 days. That night, the townsfolk gathered at the saloon, hushed and pale. It was the first time since Nora Hensley's disappearance that more than 10 people had sat in the same room. They drank little, spoke even less, and when Sheriff Burke entered, they fell entirely silent. He stood in the doorway for a moment, dusted off his boots, and said only one thing: "Bad time for wild dogs." Then he left. 2 more people went missing that week: Elijah Rowe, an old railman with one hand and half a memory, and Sarah Wicks, a widow who sold candles shaped like saints. Sarah's shop was undisturbed. Her last candle still burned when they found the room empty. Elijah's boots were found beside the frozen creek. His footprints led to the middle of the ice and then vanished. It was Jasper Mullin, the stable hand, who first raised the question no one wanted to say aloud. He said it while drinking alone in the back of the livery barn, speaking low to no one in particular. "Horse eats better'n we do. Horse ain't gone hungry a day. Horse gets bigger every time I look at her," someone overheard. Word spread. Josie's hayrack was always full, her water always clean, and though the sheriff claimed she hadn't left the paddock in weeks, more than one night Al swore they saw her trotting through town in the moonlight, riderless. Then came the night of the frost moon. A full, silver moon lit the hills with eerie clarity. Shadows were crisp as knives. Wind moved like breath between boards. On that night, 5 men saw Sheriff Burke ride out of town after dark, headed toward the hills. He carried no lantern. Josie moved like smoke. They followed. At a distance, yes, but close enough to watch him dismount near an old root cellar, long abandoned. He disappeared into it for nearly an hour. When he emerged, Josie's saddle was full, sagging under something wrapped in burlap, a sack that leaked. He rode home without speaking, without looking back. 3 of the men left town the next day. 1 stayed. His name was Declan Poe, a blacksmith with a crooked spine and a memory for faces. Declan started asking questions, quietly, respectfully, but they were questions nonetheless, about who last saw whom, about what horses eat when oats are gone, about the butcher's ledger, which now had 2 weeks unaccounted for. Then suddenly he too vanished. His forge was still hot when they found it. His bellows still moved. His apron, oddly enough, was missing. The town began to decay in silence. Church bells stopped ringing. The saloon closed at dusk. Doors stayed locked, curtains drawn, and all the while Josie remained, growing. One morning, a child pointed at her and said, "She's got thumbs." Everyone laughed nervously, but no one checked. By the final week of March, the sheriff no longer gave explanations. The town no longer asked. People passed each other without greetings. The cemetery, once quiet, now seemed restless. Mounds shifted under thawing snow. Someone nailed a sign to the church door. No one saw who. It read, "The horse remembers." Sheriff Burke tore it down. But the next day, another appeared. "So does the land." In Bleak Hollow, the snow never melted fast enough to bury the past, and as the sun rose higher each day, the question grew heavier. How long had it truly been going on? Longer than winter? Longer than memory? And maybe, just maybe, longer than Josie herself? By early April, something had settled over Bleak Hollow. Not quite peace, not grief either, something else, a kind of quiet submission, as though the entire town had agreed, without a word, to stop looking too closely. Except one man. His name was Cormac Thistle, 49. The butcher. Cormac was not a man of imagination. He wore a red apron that never came fully clean and spoke in grunts more than sentences. He had been carving meat in Bleak Hollow since the age of 17 and had seen more winter rot, more green meat, and more bone dust than anyone alive. He trusted the rules of meat. If it smelled bad, it was. If it bled grey, it didn't come from anything meant to be eaten. And lately, everything bled grey. At first, he assumed it was just the supply wagons. Snow had kept out the spring delivery. He made do. Frozen venison, pickled boar, the last of the salted cuts from December. But one morning, he found a burlap sack on his back stoop. No note. Inside were cuts, fresh, red, still cold, but not frozen. Loin, rib, some flank. But when he laid them out under the cleaver's light, something made him pause. The grain of the muscle was wrong. The fat too pale. One of the cuts had what looked like a thumbnail, barely visible at the edge, as if the butcher before him had not trimmed with care. Cormac did not scream. He was not a man who screamed. He buried the cuts deep behind his shop, under refuse. That night he did not sleep. The next morning Sheriff Burke walked in. "Town's got lean mouths," he said. "You should offer stew bones." "Folks need warm things," Cormac nodded. He watched Josie through the window. She stood tied near the trough, her head tilted toward the butcher's block, as if listening. "Had some fresh meat come in," Burke added. "Special delivery. Consider it a gift." He smiled. Cormac didn't. That night, the butcher left a rabbit trap near Josie's paddock, not to catch rabbits, but to see if something else might sniff it. At dawn, the trap was gone. Not tripped. Gone. The ground had no prints, but the trough water was muddy. Cormac began keeping notes, dates, disappearances, deliveries. The timing was too neat. Every time someone went missing, he received a parcel of meat within 48 hours. He cross-checked with the store ledger. He cross-checked with grave records. He even asked the gravedigger, a mute boy named Albie, how deep he'd dug the past month. Not deep, Albie whispered. Earth too frozen, some just under. Cormac's hands shook that night as he cut the day's bones. His cleaver slid sideways and split his thumbnail. Blood pooled. Red, not grey. He wept with relief. One morning, Burke returned. You haven't thanked me, he said. Cormac didn't look up. For what? The meat. I didn't use it. Sure you did, said Burke. Town's been talking about your stew. Said it's the richest in months. Cormac felt bile rise. I didn't serve stew. Oh? Burke leaned forward. Then someone's pretending to be you. He placed a small tin pot on the counter. Inside thick gravy. Shreds of something that might once have been a tendon. Josie whinnied outside. I brought seconds, said Burke. That night, the butcher set fire to his ledger, burned the notes, burned the chart, burned the names, but he kept the cleaver, cleaned it till it shone. He stood in the centre of his shop, surrounded by cold hooks, waiting. At midnight, someone knocked, not with a fist, with hooves. Just once, he opened the door. Josie stood alone. A rope dangled from her saddle, dragging behind her. At the end of it was something wrapped in oilskin. Cormac didn't scream. He closed the door, bolted it shut, and didn't open again till morning. By week's end, the butcher had changed. He no longer shaved, no longer spoke. He fed no one. Then one day he left. Without a word, his block was clean, his cleaver missing. In his place, a single note. I will not be complicit. No one saw him again. No one asked where he went. But from that day forward, Josie stopped looking toward the butcher's shop when she passed. She had eaten her fill. In 1867, a decade before the snow and silence of Bleak Hollow would tighten its grip, Sheriff Gideon Burke had once been just another deputy in a dusty outpost named Furnace Crossing. It was a hellish town, dry as rust and just as red, sitting on the border of nowhere and never, and that is where he met the horse. Her name, later given, was Josie. But then, she had no name. Just a foal, orphaned, ribs showing, hooves cracked. She had been left tethered in the desert sun beside a wagon whose driver had collapsed 10 feet away, face down in the sand. Buzzards had already taken interest in the man. Not the horse. Not yet. Burke had passed the wreckage on a supply run. Something in her eyes made him stop. He poured the last of his canteen into her mouth. She didn't flinch. She blinked once, then leaned her head against his shoulder like a child. He brought her back with him. Townsfolk said he was wasting time, said the beast wouldn't last a week. She lasted 6. Then 10. Then she healed, and Burke, who had been known more for brawling than for mercy, began to change too. He stopped frequenting the saloon. He stopped drawing first. He rode quieter, watched longer. Some said Josie had sobered him. Others said she had replaced something lost. A brother in the war, perhaps. A lover, no one knew. He never said. But he fed her before feeding himself. Always. And when he was promoted to Sheriff of Bleak Hollow in 1872, he brought Josie with him. No other horse ever wore his saddle. Josie was not ordinary. She did not scare from gunfire, did not bolt from thunder. She did not blink at death. In 1875, she stood still while Burke was shot in the gut during a mine payroll robbery. She dragged him 7 miles back to town, reins clenched in his bleeding hands. In 1877, she trampled a mountain lion that had killed a ranch child. And in 1879, when a group of bounty hunters came through town looking for a fugitive preacher and tried to intimidate Burke, Josie lunged without command, snapping a man's collarbone with her hooves. There was a rumour, whispered not by men but by children, that Josie understood English. She would stand still and watch them when they spoke. If someone lied, her ears would twitch. If someone told a secret, she would turn her head. One boy swore that Josie cried during a funeral. Another said she followed him home after he broke a girl's doll. Some said she knew sin. Some said she knew hunger. By 1880, Burke and Josie had become myth. They rode the edge of town every sunset. Josie's coat was black as pitch by then, not from dirt but from something else. Her mane flowed like oil in moonlight. Her eyes, still the same as the day he found her, held something that refused to blink. And Burke, older now, slower, spoke to her like a partner. They shared meals. She slept in the barn behind the sheriff's quarters, but the doors were never locked. In summer, they'd sit together near the creek, a man and a horse, and neither would move for hours. Some said he told her everything. When the first snow fell in early 1881, Josie changed. She stopped sleeping, she paced the barn, she watched the town, and Burke, who had once laughed that she was more dog than horse, began locking the barn door again. He began riding alone, but even then, she followed. In the distance. In the fog. Silent. Always there. Like memory, like guilt. Like something that had once been saved, and was now asking to be repaid. They said he once told her after a long drink at the tavern, "You saved me, so I'll feed you, even if the devil himself asks what I fed." He laughed after that. But Josie didn't. Now, in 1881, the snow deeper than any in recorded memory, the town starving, the gravedigger refusing to bury the dead deeper than a hand's length, Josie still ate. She had not thinned. Her hooves were polished, her eyes brighter. And Sheriff Burke smiled less, because some debts come due slowly, and some hunger cannot be denied, especially when it knows your name. By the second week of January, the snow in Bleak Hollow no longer fell in flakes, but in sheets, as if the sky were folding in on itself. Winds howled like wolves too weak to hunt, and doors that once creaked under their own age now screamed like violins when opened. The town had grown quieter, thinner, its people moving slower, speaking softer. The hunger had set in, not the kind that gnaws at your stomach. That stage had long passed. Now it curled up in the mind. It made men forget the taste of real meat. It made women snap at shadows, and mothers eye their children with horror when the soup ran low. It made the preacher deliver sermons about sacrifice that nobody wanted to interpret too clearly. It was during this bleak stretch of days that something began to shift at the sheriff's quarters. Josie, the horse, no longer paced. She stood still, perfectly still, staring at the door, and the sheriff began to cook. At first it was nothing unusual. A thick smell of boiling broth wafted from the chimney. With meat scarce, most homes reeked of thin potato peels, mouldy onions, and melted snow. But the smell from Sheriff Burke's kitchen was different, richer. More iron in it, sweet but not honey, spiced but not cinnamon. One by one, neighbours noticed. Even with the wind blowing the opposite direction, the scent curled around corners and drifted like a finger under noses. It pulled people toward the sheriff's house like a church bell on Sunday morning. Eloise Mather, the spinster who ran the boarding house, swore she hadn't eaten anything more solid than boiled leather in 5 days. But when she passed the sheriff's window, her knees buckled. She said it smelled like Christmas at her grandmother's in Georgia, except her grandmother had died of scarlet fever when Eloise was 6. Eli Sims, the old prospector, claimed he once smelled a dying bear in summer that gave off a similar odour. Like something wild but warm, he muttered, to no one in particular. The town didn't speak of it, openly, but they whispered. They wondered. They grew jealous. Some thought Burke had been hiding supplies. Others believed he'd made some quiet deal with the railroad bosses before the blizzard. Still others said Josie, the horse, had something to do with it, that she knew where to dig. The butcher, Arlen Crow, was the first to investigate. He was a massive man with cracked knuckles and a nose like a squashed peach. Arlen hadn't slaughtered anything in weeks, not legally anyway. His shop was dry, his hooks were empty, and his apron no longer bore fresh stains, but his nose still worked. He visited Burke under the pretense of delivering some tallow. When the sheriff opened the door, Arlen took a step inside and froze. The warmth hit him first. Thick and heavy, it felt like stepping into a lung. Then the scent, stronger inside, made his tongue curl. Behind the sheriff, a pot bubbled on the stove. Steam hissed up toward the low rafters. Josie stood in the barn beyond the window, motionless, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "What are you cooking?" Arlen asked, voice flat. Burke smiled thinly. Old recipe, from my mother. Root vegetable stew. Arlen nodded. Smells rich. Carrots do that. Haven't seen a carrot in town since Christmas. Burke's smile didn't falter. Arlen didn't ask to stay. He didn't push. He left with the tallow and an ache in his gut. That night, Arlen sat awake and made a list of every man who'd gone missing since the snows began. It was longer than he remembered. 5 names, all drifters, all strangers, all last seen near the sheriff's office. 2 nights later, the preacher knocked on Burke's door. He came with a Bible and frost on his beard. He spoke of rumors, of judgment, of the price of secrets in times of scarcity. Burke listened, nodded, never invited him in. Josie stood behind him, just visible in the hallway. Her eyes didn't blink. The preacher left with his hands shaking. That same week, the widow Haley returned from a walk with her daughter, murmuring that she saw bones being thrown into the river behind the sheriff's house. Clean bones, she whispered. Not animal, no fur. The town began to quiet further. Children stopped playing near the barn. Doors stayed shut, and Josie never looked away. By the end of the month, a second smell began to mingle with the first, sour to oily, rotting, but not quite. It came only at night, and only from the barn. Some nights the wind carried a low sound, a rhythmic scrape, like wood on concrete. Other nights there were snorts, laboured breaths, then silence. One man swore he heard a voice, not Burke, not human, just one word. More. No one asked for stew. No one confronted Burke. When a man named Josiah Clay came into town with hopes of marrying the mill owner's daughter, he stayed one night, and then vanished. Burke said he left before sunrise. The daughter said she heard footsteps all night. The butcher said nothing. But when he saw Josie the next morning, he spat in the snow and walked away. Still, no one acted, because the stew kept cooking, and Josie kept watching, and Burke, older, thinner, quieter, kept smiling, as if something had finally started to fill the hollow inside. No one knew what was in the pot, but no one wanted to be in it. So they stayed silent, and the smell lingered, like memory, like debt, like something, waiting its turn. The blizzard of early February would later be called the White Burying. For 3 days, it snowed without end, not in flakes, but in horizontal daggers of ice that buried barns, silent bells, and sealed windows from the inside. There were no travellers, no deliveries, no movement. Bleak Hollow became a tomb, and in that silence, truth began to tremble loose. Sheriff Burke sat in his parlour, boots off, spine crooked, staring into the black fireplace like it owed him answers. Josie stood in the barn, her nostrils steaming, hooves twitching like she dreamt while awake. The stew pot was empty. The last meat was gone. It was in this hour when the town was a snow globe left to freeze that someone knocked. 3 slow raps, then silence, then a whisper. Sheriff, I know. Burke opened the door to find Micah Tate, the schoolmaster's son, barely 17, gaunt as a pickaxe and twice as sharp. He had always been a quiet boy, more in love with books than bullets. But now he held a satchel tight against his chest and stared at Burke like a priest about to take confession. I've seen it, he said. Seen what? Burke asked, though he already knew. The hole, Micah whispered. Behind the barn, where snow didn't settle and the earth steamed from beneath, was a pit, deep and circular, ringed with burnt stones. It looked like a ritual site long forgotten by man, or perhaps only recently remembered. Micah had followed Josie one night, drawn by the sound of scraping hooves and the scent of warm iron. He watched as the horse stood over the pit, unmoving, while Burke poured something thick and red into the soil. Then he heard the whisper, not from Burke, but from beneath the earth, a single word. Closer. Now, the boy sat in Burke's parlour, his fingers trembling as he opened his satchel. Inside, nestled amongst worn cloth, were bones, small, delicate, and unmistakably human. They were the bones of a child, not an adult. From behind the mill, Micah said, his voice barely a whisper. near where the preacher's boy disappeared last winter. Burke stared at the grim contents, his face a mask of unreadable emotions. Then, with a sudden jerky movement, he stood. He knelt before the satchel, and then to Micah's surprise, he wept. It was not the guilt of a killer, Micah realized, watching the sheriff's shoulders shake. It was the profound soul-deep grief of a man who had given in, inch by agonizing inch, to something far older and more insidious than mere hunger. Burke, his voice hoarse with sorrow and shame, told Micah everything. He spoke of the war, a distant memory that still haunted his nights. He spoke of the cave, a place of shadows and ancient secrets. And then he spoke of Josie, the woman who had saved him from an Apache raid, how he'd followed her deep into a desolate canyon. There, he'd found a pool of black, stagnant water that hissed and recoiled when touched by sunlight. Josie had knelt there drinking, and in that horrifying moment, something had drunk her back. Burke didn't remember what he gave up first, his soul, his silence, or his spine. But when he returned to town with Josie, people noticed something had shifted, a subtle but undeniable change in his very being. He never spoke of it, not to anyone, not until now. Micah, his own fear warring with a desperate need for understanding, asked if the town was cursed. Burke shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. No, he said, curses had rules. This was something else entirely. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It's not a devil, Burke said, his eyes wide and haunted. It's older than that, hungrier. It don't want blood. It wants surrender. It wants the part of you that says, this is the way now. Micah, bewildered, asked why Burke kept feeding it, kept sacrificing to this insatiable entity. Burke simply said, because it asked nicely, and then quieter, a profound weariness in his tone. Because it saved me. They sat in the suffocating silence for an hour, the weight of Burke's confession hanging heavy in the air between them. Then Burke, with a final shuddering breath, stood. He picked up the satchel, now empty of its macabre contents, and without another word, walked out into the swirling snow. Micah watched from the window, a growing sense of dread coiling in his gut. The sheriff didn't return, but Josie did. Her hooves, usually caked with mud, were impossibly clean. Her eyes, however, held a chilling, unnatural gleam that spoke of unspeakable horrors. The snowstorm, a relentless white shroud, ended 2 days later. When it finally lifted, the town awoke to an eerie, unnatural silence. There was no sign of Burke, no sign of Micah. Only Josie, standing sentinel at the center of town, her saddle empty, her breath fogging the frigid air like a mournful funeral hymn. The stew pot left on the hearth was cold. The bones, which had caused such despair, were gone. And from behind the barn, where the earth had been frozen solid, the ground steamed, a thin wisp of vapor rising into the still air, as if something ancient and unfathomable had eaten well. When the snow finally receded, not melted but receded, like a relentless guest that overstayed its welcome and left only after devouring the very essence of the home. The townsfolk emerged from their shelters like pale, fragile ghosts. Their boots, once firm on frozen ground, now sank into the insidious sludge of thawing grief and unspoken horrors. Doors, long sealed against the howling winter and the greater terror it concealed, creaked open with a hesitant sigh. Slowly, tentatively, smoke began to coil from chimneys once more, a fragile sign of life trying to reclaim its rhythm. But the silence did not lift. It lingered, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on the small town, heavier and more profound than the snow had ever been. It was the silence of absence, of a gaping void where leadership and protection once stood, because Sheriff Burke was still gone, vanished as completely as if the earth had simply swallowed him whole, leaving behind only whispers and unease. And Josie remained, always Josie. It was Hiram Nettle, the proprietor of the general store, a man whose hands were gnarled from years of counting change and lifting crates, who stumbled upon the truth. Not because he was a nosy man. Hiram was far from the type to meddle in affairs that weren't his own, but he possessed an almost compulsive habit of committing everything to paper. Every last nail sold, every remaining can of peaches, every transaction recorded meticulously. Who paid on credit, who bartered with animal pelts, who offered favors, or, more chillingly, something worse. His meticulous nature, once a quirk, now proved to be the town's reluctant key to understanding. He found the sheriff's personal copy of the town's ledger tucked away under a loose floorboard in the sheriff's abandoned office. It was a thin, black book, surprisingly light for the weight of its contents, wrapped in a brittle oilskin cover to protect it from damp and decay. Stamped on the cover in fading but still legible gold leaf were two stark words, feed and fodder. But it wasn't about oats. It wasn't about hay. It wasn't about anything that nourished the town's livestock. It was about meat. Each page, instead of listing items sold or payments received, bore a single chilling record. Names. Not inventory, not financial transactions. Just names, and beside each name, a stark red ink crossout. A date, alongside a tally mark, chillingly indicating a regular pattern. Micah Tate, Ellie James, Reverend Holden's boy, Daniel. 22 names in total, 22 souls, all gone, all dated. Each entry followed by a precise weight, pounds and ounces, and most horrifyingly a small, clinical note beside some, liver intact. Ribs splintered, charred bone. Hiram felt the air leach from his lungs. He couldn't breathe. His fingers, trembling, flipped back to the earliest entries. Names from before the snow, before the sheriff's mysterious disappearance. Names from 3 winters ago. The ledger went back years. The disappearances hadn't begun with the crushing winter. They had merely accelerated. A list this long, this disturbingly consistent, couldn't be the work of Burke alone. Someone else knew. Someone else had helped. Someone else was complicit. He showed the dreadful book to Nora Bell, the town's soft-spoken schoolteacher, her face blanching with each name, and to Enoch the blacksmith, whose usual robust demeanor crumbled into a look of profound horror. Word spread through the quiet town like spilled kerosene, not shouted, but whispered, each hushed syllable carrying the weight of a shared nightmare. But no one demanded answers. No one screamed in outrage. They read the ledger as one might read forbidden scripture, with an initial, overwhelming disbelief that slowly, chillingly, morphed into a shameful, gut-wrenching acceptance. And with acceptance came fear. What truly terrified them wasn't merely the grotesque horror of what the sheriff had done, or the fate of those listed within the book's grim pages. It was the crushing realization that they had all eaten well when others went missing. The unsettling truth settled deep in their bones. Their survival had been predicated on an unspeakable sacrifice. The widow Roslyn, frail and prone to trembling, admitted to Burke having given her fresh haunch one bitterly cold November, claiming it was elk. She had savoured it, she confessed, claiming she hadn't tasted anything so rich since her husband died in 78. Preacher Morgan, a man of God now broken, wept openly behind the chapel, confessing he'd found an unnerving amount of blood near the church's back fence last spring and, in his pious denial, had simply thought it was a fox kill. He'd said nothing. Enoch the blacksmith, his burly frame slumping, remembered Josie chewing on something behind the stable. Something long, something soft, something that had made him turn away, a sick dread coiling in his stomach. He had turned away, they had all turned away, and then there was the ink. The last 5 names in the ledger weren't written in the familiar red. They were inscribed in a disturbing brown, grainy fluid, thicker, sticky, smudged, as if still wet, still drying. It wasn't ink, it was blood. That night, the townspeople gathered in the general store, the air heavy with unarticulated dread. They didn't scream. They didn't rage. There was no room for such open displays of emotion, only a profound, communal shock. They whispered, their voices barely audible above the creaks of the old floorboards. What do we do with Josie? Where did Burke go? Is it over? Hiram, seeking some impossible clarity, opened the back window. A blast of frigid air poured in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the lingering, metallic tang of fear. Josie stood in the center of the deserted street, still, watching, breathing. Her bridle, usually meticulously cared for, was untouched. sagging forgotten on her dark head. Her eyes, usually dark and placid, now glinted amber in the meager lantern light emanating from the store, reflecting the flickering flames within. She hadn't moved in hours, rooted to the spot, except to turn and face the window. Her gaze, unnervingly intelligent, seemed to pierce through the glass, through the shadows, directly into the fearful hearts of the townsfolk huddled inside. The townsfolk voted, a chilling, unspoken pact. No outsiders would be told. The book, a testament to their complicity and the town's dark secret, would be returned beneath the floorboard, hidden once more. The pit behind the barn, the one no one would acknowledge aloud, a shallow depression in the earth that had swallowed more than just debris, would be filled with ash, buried and forgotten, its gruesome purpose erased from the town's collective memory. The ledger would be sealed, not burned, not destroyed, because something might want to add more names, and they needed to know when. They needed to be warned. In the weeks that followed, life resumed, in the shallow, hollow way that people go through the motions when memory feels like a slow-acting poison, when every meal carries the faint taste of guilt. The church bell rang its customary tolls, summoning the faithful. The general store reopened its doors, the creak of its hinges a familiar, yet strangely sinister sound. School children recited poems they didn't understand, their innocent voices a jarring counterpoint to the town's dark secret. And Josie walked, one house per night, just once around it, her hooves soft on the thawing earth, a rhythmic, haunting presence. Never knocking, never leaving a visible mark, but always circling, a silent, perpetual sentinel, a constant reminder of the unseen hunger that still stalked their quiet lives. People, driven by a primal, desperate need to appease, began to leave offerings outside their homes. Not meat, not what had been taken, but symbolic objects. Ribbons fluttering in the breeze, coins glinting dully in the morning sun, doll shoes, tiny and forlorn. Hiram, a man haunted by the knowledge of what lay within the ledger, left a page torn from its very heart, folded into a precise square, a desperate plea for understanding, perhaps even for forgiveness. Josie sniffed it, left it untouched, but the next morning the wind had blown the page away, or something had. This ends with the town steeped in a slow-burn pact of ignorance, a chilling testament to the human capacity for denial in the face of overwhelming horror. The book still exists, a silent record of their complicity. Josie still walks, a shadowy, hoofed embodiment of their dread. And every so often, someone, in the dead of night or the quiet of dawn, checks the last page, just to make sure their name isn't there. Not yet, not tonight, but maybe soon. The name, once a whisper, then a distant echo, began to resurface even before the man himself did. Sheriff Burke. Someone uttered it in the saloon, the words slurred after one glass too many than another. There was no fear in the pronouncement, no reverence, merely the invocation of a ghost, a placeholder for an absence that had stretched into months. The town, left leaderless, had chosen silence over the arduous task of a new election, structure forsaken for a weary quiet. Yet the title lingered, a tenacious tendril of smoke clinging to an old coat, refusing to dissipate entirely. The children, their innocence a stark contrast to the town's somber mood, whispered it as they skipped stones across the brittle surface of the frozen creek. The preacher, in a moment of unguarded slip during a Sunday sermon, spoke the name aloud, then stuttered, catching himself just in time to replace it with the more fitting, albeit equally chilling, sinner. And then, with the deceptive gentleness of a new dawn, he returned. There was no grand entrance, no thundering hooves announcing his arrival. He didn't ride in, dusty and triumphant, nor did he bother with the polite formality of a knock. He simply materialized, a silent, unmoving figure, standing on the frost-kissed steps of the church as the first tentative rays of sun began to fracture the night's chill. The same hat, its brim slightly bowed with familiarity, sat low on his brow. The same coat, worn but unyielding, draped over his shoulders. But the face, something was undeniably missing. It wasn't the raw aftermath of a bruise, nor the subtle etchings of age. It was less, as if the very essence of memory, of recognition, had been meticulously scraped clean with a dull, unfeeling blade, leaving behind a smooth, unsettling blankness. His boots, remarkably, bore no trace of the journey, no clinging mud from the unforgiving earth. His breath, in the crisp morning air, offered no visible vapor, defying the chill. He did not blink, his gaze fixed, unwavering. On some unseen point beyond the town, it was Josie, the lone mare tethered patiently behind the chapel, who broke the unnerving stillness. Her soft neigh, a fragile ripple in the profound quiet. Burke, as if drawn by an invisible thread, walked towards the center of town, his footsteps making no sound on the frozen ground. He stopped beneath the rusted, silent bell tower, a sentinel of forgotten promises. No words were spoken, none needed, only the faint, almost imperceptible jingle of his belt, a metallic whisper in the vast quiet. By noon, the townsfolk, drawn by an unspoken force, had gathered. There had been no summons, no shouted commands, only a gravitational pull, as if they were collectively tethered to something ancient, something owed. He raised his hand, a slow, deliberate gesture that held the weight of unspoken command. He pointed, first, to the store, its windows reflecting the pale, hesitant sun, then to the church, the very steps he had stood upon, to the pit, a forgotten scar on the edge of town, and finally, his finger settled, unmoving, on the butcher, Micah Tate. A man known for his gruff exterior and unyielding demeanor did not flinch. He stepped forward, his eyes locked with the sheriff's unreadable gaze. "I burned the ledger." His voice, though quiet, resonated with the clarity of a confession. Burke blinked, a slow, almost imperceptible movement. "That was new. I scattered the ashes in the creek." "No more names!" Micah's voice held a defiant edge, a desperate plea for absolution. A profound stillness settled over the gathered townsfolk, a collective holding of breath. And then a smile. But it wasn't the sheriff's lips that curved. It was Josie. Her lips, a dark velvety line, curled, not wide, not human, but a distinct, unsettling curve. Enough. A collective shiver rippled through the townsfolk. A visceral recognition of something profoundly wrong. The sheriff turned, his movement as fluid and silent as a shadow. He walked back into the barn behind the chapel, Josie trailing behind him, her silent presence a chilling companion. He did not look back. That night, the moon hung in the sky, a bruised copper orb bleeding an ominous light onto the hushed town. No one slept. The air was thick with unspoken fear, a palpable dread that clung to every breath. Some, with trembling hands, packed meager belongings, their movements furtive and silent. Some wept, silent tears carving paths through the dust on their faces, their sobs swallowed by the oppressive quiet. But no one spoke. The very thought of speech felt sacrilegious, an invitation to a horror too terrible to name, because the bell, the rusted, silent bell of the tower, rang at midnight, a single, mournful toll that pierced the suffocating silence, and they all saw the rope move, swaying gently, impossibly, without the touch of a human hand, and they all heard the hooves on the roof, not the hurried clatter of a panicked horse, but a slow, deliberate cadence. One by one, around and around, circling, waiting, counting, each slow, heavy hoofbeat a chilling tally, a silent promise of what was to come. The rhythmic thudding was a drumbeat of doom, echoing in the terrified stillness of the night, a sound that would forever haunt the town's nightmares. The frost never truly departed after that fateful night. Even with the arrival of spring, when the meadows burst forth in vibrant bloom, and the sun ascended higher in the azure sky, a persistent frost clung to the chapel roof, etched itself onto the bell rope, and glistened on Josie's saddle, and, chillingly, it crowned Burke's hat. No one had ever truly seen him in the light of day. Not really. It was only at dusk, as the air deepened to a spectral blue, and the wind began its mournful shift, that his outline would flicker into a discernible being. He would trace the worn length of Main Street, a silent, relentless shadow trailing Josie, his horse. He never uttered a single word, yet his unspoken presence was enough to cast a pall over the town. People ceased venturing out of their homes after sunset. They stopped bestowing their children with the names of the old, revered families. They even abandoned the practice of hanging mirrors, for it became chillingly clear that reflections lied. The preacher, a man of stout faith, attempted to confront him just once. He stood on the chapel steps, his body trembling, a silver cross clutched in his shaking hand. Burke stepped forward, a deliberate, measured pace. The preacher, summoning what little courage remained, lifted the cross higher. Burke halted. Josie, mirroring his stillness, also stopped. The preacher opened his mouth, intending to begin a prayer, but a sudden, visceral choke seized him. The silver cross slipped from his grasp. It hissed upon hitting the ground, as if plunged into an unseen flame. Burke, with a strange, unsettling grace, bent down and picked it up. He extended it back to the preacher, his gaze unreadable. Then he simply turned and walked away. That was when the dreams began, a shared nightmare that wove its way through the collective unconscious of the town. Everyone experienced them, the same dream. They whispered in hushed, terrified tones over their morning porridge, a door slightly ajar, beckoning, the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats on wooden floors echoing in the darkness, the primal scent of iron and fur, thick and unsettling. And Burke's voice, not words but a guttural breathing unnervingly close to their ear. In the suffocating distance, the persistent clang of the bell, not ringing in celebration or warning but tolling, counting. One by one the town's inhabitants vanished, not in groups, not in the reassuring light of day. They would simply be gone. Their houses stood unlocked, a silent testament to their hasty departure. Their beds remained unslept in, the sheets undisturbed. Always their shoes were left at the door, a chilling signature of their disappearance. Burke never pursued them. Josie never bothered to sniff out their vanishing scent. It was only the ones who remained, the ones who knew, the ones who ate, that he meticulously circled. Then came the wind, a dry, relentless wind from the north, carrying with it a sound unlike any they had ever heard. Not music, not a howl, but a shrill, low, and constant whistle. The ancient trees bent away from the town as if recoiling in fear. Crows flew in disoriented, chaotic circles above, and from the very ground behind the barn, a new, horrifying growth emerged. Black vines, thick and pulsating like veins, snaked outward. They wrapped themselves around the old well, around the sturdy doorframe of the chapel, and, most disturbingly, around Josie's hooves. And she neighed, not in warning, not in fear, but in welcome. One final time, the remaining townsfolk gathered. They brought with them the last vestiges of their existence, ledgers, ancient relics, the final scraps of meat they had not dared to eat. They congregated in the centre square, beneath the rusted, silent bell. Burke arrived, his presence as inevitable as the coming night. Josie, his loyal companion, was by his side. The townsfolk, a shrinking, terrified circle, stood before them. And then, one by one, they stepped forward, not to beg for mercy, not to confess their sins, but to be counted, to accept their fate, to pay their due. Burke raised a hand, a silent, chilling gesture. The bell, with a deep, resonant clang, rang once, and from the sky, as if summoned by an unseen force, the snow returned. Thick, sudden, soundless. It descended, a white shroud, burying the chapel first, then the barn, then the entire town square. When the very last flake settled, the town was utterly, completely gone. Nothing remained but a single stark hoofprint etched into the frost, and a ledger open to a blank, pristine page. Waiting. Epilogue. 1921, a road crew, carving a new path along Montana Route 87, unearthed a gruesome discovery behind what was once a barn foundation. The bones were charred, marked with an unknown symbol, and meticulously laid in 22 neat rows. The surveyor, a stoic man accustomed to the unexpected, noted fossilized hoofprints, ancient and immutable. They found no structures, no remnants of buildings that once stood. No records existed, no hint of a community that had vanished. Only a rusted bell buried 6 feet beneath a thick layer of ash, and a book. Stamped on its faded cover the words, "Feed and Fodder." Inside, only one name, scrawled in brown, indelible ink. The last entry, unreadable.